Great. All right, welcome everyone again. As you see, we have translation in French and English. Please introduce yourself in the chat. So as I'm sure all of you know, today we're going to be talking about multilateral processes and why they matter. And we're doing that because this past month, MCLD was represented at two important multilateral forums, the Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development in Spain, and the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, which happened in New York. And we want to know, why does this matter to MCLD? Why does it matter to community-led development? Why does it matter to all of us and to our work and our community partners? In today's call, we're going to hear from our own Gunjan Veda and from John Coonrod, as well as 4 colleagues who are joining us from member organizations and partners. And then we'll have time for discussion and questions. And at the very end, as always, we'll just share some updates, including on some other ways that all of us can feed into some multilateral policies upcoming in September and October. And the goal today, as you're going to hear in a moment from Gunjan, is to demystify these processes and, to be frank, to have an honest conversation about it. So what's really important is to remember that every question that we have is helpful. So please use the chat to put in your questions and your comments, both at the end when we have time for discussion, but throughout the whole call. Kathy will be monitoring it, so we will make sure that we see your questions. And really importantly, these conversations can end up having a lot of technical terms and jargon, and we are all going to really try to avoid using any acronyms or like really overly technical terms. But if anything is said that isn't clear, please ask in the chat, because if you are curious about it and aren't sure, then that means other people have the same question. And with that, I'm going to actually first hand it over to Gunjan Veda, MCLD's Global Secretary, who isn't actually with us live right now, but she wanted to share, so she recorded herself. And she's going to introduce a little bit more on, again, why it's important and timely for MCLD to participate in these spaces and how it connects to the 4 pillars of MCLD's new strategic plan, to our vision, and to responding to the current moment in our sector and in the world. And you're going to notice that her video is going to end a little bit abruptly. So forgive that. We will have our other speakers are going to pick up where she left off. So Sarah, if you can go ahead and play her video.
Hello everyone. Greetings for whatever time of the day it is in your part of the world. I'm currently in India, so it is evening for me. I'm really excited to welcome you to today's call. As you know, for the last 15 months, MCLD has been in the process of co-creating our strategic plan for 2025 to 2029. Earlier this year, after a series of co-creation and consultation spaces and exercises with our members, our Global Assembly ratified the 4 pillars of our strategic plan: policy, practice, solidarity, and self-reliance. We also, together with members, identified what is it that we want to do under each of these pillars, where do we want to focus our energies, what activities we want to undertake. The final draft of this plan is actually currently open for feedback. So if you have not provided your feedback, please do so before August 1, when we will consolidate everything to have the final draft ready for the Global Assembly. But going back to our strategic plan, policy was one of the 4 pillars of our strategic plan, but policy advocacy is not new for MCLD. However, in the current global environment, when we see an increase in protectionism and isolationism, when we see countries withdrawing from their commitments towards multilateralism and cooperation, it has become even more urgent. In our new strategic plan, we make a commitment to strengthen multilateralism, but not multilateralism in its current form, which is colonial, which exacerbates the power differences by giving some countries way more power and control than the rest of the world. But the multilateralism which is founded in equity and justice, where all countries, including countries from the majority world, have an equal say in the policies and decisions which are being formulated. That is the multilateralism that we seek to create, build, and strengthen. But doing that requires that community leaders, CBOs, local organizations, local governments, national civil society is all part of the conversations around international financial architecture, around UN reforms, around the multilateral system. And we know this is not the case. And this is not the case for multiple reasons. One, the spaces are pretty exclusive, right? So the events take place in countries where we can't get visas to. Even if we get visas, we don't have the passes to enter these spaces. Civil society's presence is extremely limited. And increasing over the last few years, we have seen attempts to further limit the space for civil society to be present in these areas. At the same time, a lot of these conversations are shrouded in so much jargon that for many of us, it's very difficult to understand what it is that they are talking about and how is it that these conversations directly impact us, our lives, our organizations, the communities we are a part of, even our countries. And so we choose to not focus on them. And yet, there is an opportunity. We are at a time where the current system, the system which is unjust and colonial, is collapsing. And there are increasingly conversations on what kind of system should replace this. There are conversations around how this can be an opportunity to build something which is just and equitable. And so it is very important that our members, that all of you, that local governments, that local civil society, majority world stakeholders are a part of these conversations to ensure that the system that comes about is just and equitable. So one of the tasks that MCLD has taken on itself this year is to not just be present in these spaces to make sure that the voices and the aspirations of our members and the countries and the communities that they are a part of are reflected in our interventions and in the activities that we take in these spaces, but to demystify these spaces, to demystify these conversations for all of us so that we do not feel so lost and we see how they have such a profound and direct impact on our lives, right? I was at the Financing for Development conference in Sevilla recently, and I can tell you, there were times when I just felt like a fish out of water. I didn't understand what it was that was going on because it was so technical. And so part of what we want to do with today's call and with a series of activities throughout this year is to demystify these places, is to break down, remove all the jargon and see in simple terms what are some of the key things which are at stake. How do they influence us? And to have conversations around what form do we want these key decisions to take. And that is why today's call is so important in our work and in the new strategic plan and in operationalizing it. Two critical events have taken place in the last 1 month. The first was the Financing for Development conference that I just referenced. This was the 4th Financing for Development conference. It took place in Sevilla in Spain at the end of June, beginning of July. The second was the high-level political forum of the United Nations, which has just finished in New York. So in today's call, we are going to speak to both of these. Not just what happened here and the outcomes and how they impact us, but also why were these conversations so important in the first place? Why did MCLD decide to be there? What were some of the key things which were at stake? We have pulled together today a group of people who can share much more about these spaces with us so that we can begin conversations on how MCLD wants to show up in these spaces, what we want to say, how our members want to engage in these dialogues and conversations. So I'm not going to try and summarize what happened or why it's important for us. I know the other speakers we have today will be doing that. But I do want to very briefly mention why I went to Sevilla. and why we felt that MCLD should be present at Sevilla. For a long time, there has been conversations around locally led development, and MCLD has been at the forefront of these conversations. But we have also always said that the conversations around locally led development have essentially been reduced to conversations around money. And that's insufficient. All locally led development tried to do was to make an extremely unjust colonial system a little less unjust by going for the low-hanging fruits, right? And we saw that it could not deliver. We saw despite major changes, no country has met its target or has met the aspirational target which was set in the grand bargain and later in donor statements, after statements and commitments, that 25% of resources will flow directly to local actors. But here's the challenge. Even if a country had been able to do that, the reality is in the current system, money flow, aid, or official development assistance, as we call it, is highly fickle. It depends on the government in power in different countries. And suddenly it can be withdrawn, which is what we saw happen this year, and we all face the consequences of that, right? And we want to ensure that this does not happen again. And this is why at MCLD we focus on systems change, because we recognize that unless there is a true shift in power dynamics, in decision making, we will continue to be at the mercy of political winds in different countries around the world, and lives will be lost. But then if locally led development was just about incremental change and is insufficient and unable to deliver in the absence of systems change, what is it that we need? Well, we have to look at the big picture, and this is where the multilateral conversation becomes so important. Multilateralism is nothing but spaces where multiple countries agree upon policies, conventions, declarations, which they all agree to abide by, right? So anything from travel rules and regulations to tax conventions to debt, all of that is determined in these multilateral spaces.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you, Gunjan, for your virtual message. As I said, it cuts off a little bit abruptly, but drawing on what happens in multilateral spaces and what gets determined there, I'm going to hand it over to John to share a little bit about how MCLD has been a part of these forums for a long time and actually has been really changing the direction. So John, over to you.
Great, Nellie, thank you. And can you hear me? Yeah, good. Okay, so I want to start with my t-shirt that I got at the UN because it simplifies things enormously. It says peace, dignity, equality in a healthy world. That is what we want. And so I'm going to show some slides here on how we're trying to do that. Where's the share button? Share. Okay. Chrome tab. Share. Okay. Are you seeing it? No, you're not seeing it. Okay. How about now?
Yep, we see it.
Okay, great. So the UN would not exist were it not for civil society. Civil society dragged leaders to the very first formation meeting of the United Nations in 1945. Civil society helped write the UN Charter. And the UN Charter recognizes the legitimate role of civil society in Article 70. So CSOs, like us, civil society organizations like each of us, can apply for status to attend all UN conferences, which I've been doing since 1985. We kept dragging people, we being civil society, kept dragging our leaders step by step to expand the rights of people and to take on challenges like the Earth Summit in 1992. And the 1992 Earth Summit created a new formal mechanism for non-state actors, civil society and others, to take the podium at major events. That system was called major groups, businesses, children and youth, farmers, indigenous people, local governments. So each of these groups gets a speaking slot in all UN summits. Each group is independent of the UN. It picks its own members, it's inclusive, and all of us can be represented through the major groups. Here is, for example, a former MCLD staff member, Mary Kay Costello, and her young youth colleague. She was chairing the youth major group, and it was on that big podium where you see your heads of state. She was speaking. So, as you know, MCLD was launched on a nationally televised event in Malawi on March 15th, 2015, under the banner Localizing the SDGs. We had banner after banner that said Localizing the SDGs for many, many years. Exactly 2 months later, we held a session at the first Financing for Development conference, which called for increased aid for local development. And they committed to it at that time. Haven't delivered on that commitment, but the delivery of commitments is a big priority in our strategy. Just 10 weeks later, at the Sustainable Development Summit, our representative Osa, sitting alongside Bill and Melinda Gates and Jeffrey Sachs, announced the existence of MCLD to the world. As of 2023, the UN officially got the message that 2/3 of all the SDG targets can only be met at the community level. And now localizing the SDGs is a big deal at the UN, as it was at this month's UN high-level political forum. And this is the session. It had hundreds of people there. To accelerate the progress on the SDGs, the UN has elevated the Local 2030 network to drive localization across all the UN agencies, UNFPA, UNICEF, WHO, all of them have this mandate to localize the SDGs. A powerful place for MCLD members to intervene is to partner with local government to create local SDG progress reports called voluntary local reviews and submit them to the UN. In fact, Local 2030 is calling on us, has written to us and other networks like ours this week to send them little messages on how we have been working on these 6 priorities within the SDGs: social protection and decent jobs, transforming the education systems, digital transformation, energy access and affordability, food systems transformation, climate change, and biodiversity. All of you are working in those areas in different ways. And if you sent me an email with just 3 sentences of what you've been doing, I can turn that into the UN. So I want to inundate them in the next week with the positive steps that we are taking to achieve these UN goals. So that is, in shorthand, how we can directly have our voices heard at the at these events. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back to Nellie.
Thanks, John. And I am going to do the same and turn it over to our 4 colleagues who are joining us. So I will introduce all of them first. Sarah, if you don't mind putting up the slide with their faces and names, and then I will turn it over. So Today, we are joined first by Fiana Arbab, who is Oxfam International's policy advisor on gender justice and international finance institutions. There, she works to hold the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund accountable to economic and social justice. We also have Mahinour ElBadrawi, who's the Global Partnerships Lead with Center for Economic and Social Rights, and she's focused on using international human rights law to push for justice in the global economic model. Then we have Vitalice Meja, who is the executive director of the Reality of Aid Africa Network, a Pan-African network working to eradicate poverty through effective development cooperation. And he is also the co-chair for the Civil Society Partnership for Development Effectiveness. And finally, there's Emma Burgisser, who's the economic justice lead at Christian Aid, where she leads the work on international economic decision-making in spaces like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the G20. So with that, Fiana, I will hand it over to you to introduce us to Financing for Development, the other forum that we're speaking about today, and what it's all about and some of the key questions and perspectives. Over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nellie. And it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thanks so much, John, for setting up the broad context and the framing. But ultimately, sustainable development and the SDGs cannot be achieved without financing. And we have to talk about financing not only in terms of delivering on the SDGs, but also as a reflection of the way that our global economy, down to the local economic frameworks, are designed and implemented and function. So when we talk about financing for development, it's about social justice, it's about economic rights, it's about challenging the norms and challenging the economic rules by which, unfortunately, our own development is also restrained and restricted. So I hope that props up the importance of engaging in financing for development specifically as the official forum to debate, to immediately right now compromise, and to secure commitments from member states on how we are going to finance development moving forward. Next slide, please. Just to give a bit of a background as to where we have been to set up the framework for financing for development. Next slide. So what the heck is international financial architecture? Essentially, it is a framework, and some have suggested it is a non-system. So it's far less clear, far less formal than you might think or suggest, just based on reading textbooks about, the economic rules and patterns of behavior. It's not really set in stone. Rather, international financial architecture is a reflection of historical, let's say, obviously a reflection of colonialism, colonial structures. It's been codified and crafted since 1945, post-World War II. This international financing system has been designed by and for the wealthiest countries in the world. Ultimately, the fundamental function of the IFA, as we shorthand call it, is to safeguard the stability and function of global monetary and financial systems. So it was to set up the global financial system and markets post-World War II. And I won't go too much deeper into that history, except to again emphasize that at the root of development finance is also intertwined with international development cooperation, vice versa. And I'm sure some of you are more familiar with IDC than with the IFA, but they go hand in hand. Ultimately, why we as civil society are engaged and continue to engage in tackling international financial architecture is because it's a reflection of a tale of two worlds. There is a growing gap between the haves and have-nots, between wealthy states and low-income states, otherwise dubbed as developing countries. And ultimately, we also know that today, only 17% of SDG targets are on track to be achieved by 2030. So we're still questioning, are we going to make it? The answer so far seems no. So we have to ask ourselves why. Why is it? It's been 4 to 6 decades at this point since development was first declared as a thing post World War II. Why is it taking so long to achieve this ever so elusive development? Next slide, please. Thank you. So at the systemic root, right, when we analyze poverty and inequality through a systemic lens, we can identify specific sections of the global financial and monetary system that plays different roles in upholding the system and the rules that we have today. So that includes governance of public international financial institutions, such as multilateral development banks like World Bank, International Monetary Fund, IFC, who set the standards for a lot of fiscal and monetary policies that are implemented by governments at national level. There are finance standard setters and who establish norms for the governance of private finance, such as the Financial Stability Board or the Bank for International Settlements, you may have heard of. There are monetary agreements, trade agreements, as well as regional financial arrangements and a network of bilateral swap lines that also impacts these rules. There are also informal country groupings that act as norm setters, such as the G7 you may have heard of, or the G20, which are a group of, again, wealthy states who informally set the norms of trade, monetary, and fiscal policies. There are also formal but non-universal or non-inclusive norm-setting bodies like the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. There are creditor groups that address sovereign debt issues, including the Paris Club, the London Club, the Common Framework for Debt Treatments, etc. And of course, you have the United Nations as a social norm setter and implementer. And then you have official development assistance, ODA. The agreement back in the International Development Strategy of 1971 was that developed wealthy countries should provide assistance to a minimum level of 0.7% of their gross domestic product, GDP, as a call for a major financial resource transfer for development. So there are all these different frameworks, norms, standards that are being set in the international financial architecture. But where is development in all this? Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So as John also alluded to a bit in the formation of the UN, there was a lot of debate about the priorities of what has increasingly become a global community. Development actually first became a central theme for the UN in 1960, when the organization admitted 17 newly independent countries that dramatically changed the composition of UN membership, which was, again, entirely of the colonial states and wealthy nations. At the time, the most urgent concern was to reduce world hunger. And ultimately, it was declared that the solution to hunger is an effective speeding up of economic development. But over time, it was revealed that economic growth alone is no longer sufficient. And therefore, through many world conferences, declarations, and agendas, financing for development became a platform to discuss and make decisions regarding structural root causes of inequality and poverty. I apologize. I will speak slower. So FFD is ultimately a forum where all countries have equal voting power and discuss and make decisions regarding financing for development. Next slide, please. So in brief, we have behind the official track, I guess is what I'll call the FFD journey. You have several consensus, declarations, agendas later, where through, an accumulation of such, now we have established the importance of shared responsibilities between developed and developing countries in mobilizing resources. There has been an increased focus on international financial flows and private capital, so mobilizing the private sector for development. Next slide, please. And then we have the next following slides will include the agendas specifically as an outcome of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was deliberated during FFD4, which just happened in Sevilla last month. Next slide. Great. So specifically, where is the feminist angle in all of this? So some of the key issues that we had to think about and advocate for, against, around was the basics. We needed to make sure that poverty had a feminist, we had a feminist understanding of poverty, underscoring the importance of gender budgeting, having gender disaggregated data, statistical information, including impact assessments through investment priorities, debt to austerity link, I'm going to come back to in a bit. But just to know that that was a crucial advocacy point for civil society during the FFD for reasons like most social spending there is more spending on debt repayments than there is available for countries to pay and to spend on social services and social spending. So that includes education, social protection, healthcare. And oftentimes, social spending is the first to be cut because these norm setters and international financial institutions advise governments that in order to maintain stability of their macroeconomic condition, they need to cut social spending, which we know causes irreversible harm and great detriment to society across the globe. Yeah, and of course, we have to talk about missing frameworks, including around human rights and the SDGs, which my colleagues will speak to in a bit. Next slide. Global economic governance, progressive taxation. Next slide. Private capital mobilization, somewhat undermining also the ability of or interest and commitment of governments to invest in the public sector. We have to think about care work, financing for care systems. We have to think about moving beyond GDP, which is a bit more theoretical. But its main claims is that GDP does not count productive value that is essential to human life and sustaining a dignified life, including care work. And of course, considerations around decent work and female labor sector participation. Next slide, please. Ultimately, in this space, the most feminist analytical opportunity or approach that you can uptake is a structural one. So again, I discussed austerity are policies implemented by governments with the intention of reducing budget deficit and sovereign debt. but at the cost of social spending. We also are wary of the fact that currently 85% of national governments that responded to COVID-19 indicated plans to undertake fiscal consolidation. And globally, we're feeling the impacts of that today. And some of the solutions that we had debated and discussed, again, my colleagues will chat about too, include pushing for progressive taxation, SDRs. I always forget what the acronym is. Special drawing rights, which is a very technical term within the confines of IMF, let's just say reallocation of resources from rich countries to lower income countries, implementing social spending goals, and promoting supportive laws to promote decent and high quality work. Yeah, so I think we'll end here so I can give my colleagues more time to dive deeper into where we're going next. But I hope this was a useful framing and beginning to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Fiana. And we will also share all of the slides with everybody afterwards, so you can refer back to them as well. And I'm about to pass over to Mahinour, who is going to speak specifically building from where Fiana left off on, what are these bigger categories of issues. She's going to speak to, like, what do those mean for us? What do they mean in terms of our real lives and for communities and the experiences that we have? And just one thing to note, her slides, the ones that you see on the screen, are going to be in English only, but we will post the French and the Spanish versions into the chat, so you can access them there. We'll also share those afterwards by email, and she will also be speaking through the slides. So just remember to be on the right translation channel if you need. So Mahinour, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nelly, and thank you everyone for having me today. I work with the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and we are a global organization, like Nelly said, that works on utilizing human rights and the work of the human rights movement to realize social and economic and environmental and racial justice for everyone. So if we could flip the slide, please. Yeah, so today I wanted to share with you some of the reflections from a rights-based perspective that can connect our lived reality on a local level to what's happening in those global processes that John and Fiana shared with us some today. Maybe for context, so I'm from Egypt. I'm based in New York. So before being at CSR, I worked extensively with national and local communities in Egypt. So that topic is very close to my heart, how we can really connect our realities to what's happening on the global level and how we can influence it, or at least contribute to influencing and impact what happens globally. So if we could maybe switch on. Yeah, so I'm going to maybe cover only a few topics that we'll see come repeatedly in HLPF and the financing for development process, and also that reflect in the Sustainable Development Goals, which a lot of us are probably connected to. So issues of debt, for example, is crucially connected to the services that we receive. The more government spends on debt, the less it has resources to spend on schools, hospitals, food, daycare, issues like that. On tax, typically we see a pattern of injustice where there's tax evasions, meaning the rich persons, individuals, and corporations avoid taxes, but communities pay unfairly more. If you look at the percentages at the end of the day, it also relates to how climate money doesn't reach those who are most affected, and how budgets often ignore women and gender justice issues, which lead to the question that was put in the chat around the feminization of poverty, meaning that poverty has a female, has a woman's face. And also this is like looking at that context today, this is really how those global decisions that tell our governments how they must behave so that they're accepted and they can get investments and businesses on, you know, and from the global community affect our rift reality. So if we can switch to the next slide, please. Let me see. Yeah, so can we maybe, is there a way to make the slide a little bit smaller so it shows to everyone? I'm not sure if everyone sees it in the right size, or is it just for me?
I see the whole slide.
Okay, great. So it must be
Hope
my,
everybody else does.
okay, that's great. Yeah, so basically what we do at CSR is to work with communities to expose how the unfair economic system harms people's rights. We try and work with communities to build evidence through their lived experience that supports the research that can make the case for the change that we want on the global level. And we also advocate for alternatives from the experience of those on the ground that can give a different model of care, justice, and redistribution of resources. And in that way, it's important to really think about how our struggles aren't isolated, that we're all part of that bigger system where all those issues are interrelated. And probably as communities, a lot of you and your organizations are already involved in a way or another, like John said, in work that very much connects to the global. We can switch on, please. Yeah, so specifically, why does the Financing for Development conference mean? It's basically the space where world leaders will decide where the money comes from, how it's allocated, and how is it spent on issues that are like the SDGs and business models and investments that return onto our communities. So in a way, the conference in Sevilla, our assessment that it wasn't a magic solve all solution, but it was maybe a stepping stone for some possible change. And Emma will tell us more about that. But maybe quickly, what I want to share with you all is that this system doesn't exist in a vacuum, that the Financing for Development and the HLPF and all those multilateral global conferences are connected to the UN, and under the UN, governments have human rights obligations that inform how states legally are have duties towards us and our communities, that there should accordingly form policies of how they deal with all those issues in a certain way that advances our rights, and instead of harming them. And a lot of that is under the International Covenant of Economic and Social Cultural Rights. And I will share some of those specific policy issues and the obligation of the states to act in a way that advances our community well-being, and then a little bit of what we can do each in those areas. So if we can switch the slide, please. Yeah, so on the topic of debt, that's a big issue that is discussed in all those spaces. And again, as we mentioned, debt payments when the government doesn't generate enough resources. They mean cuts on care, on education. And then in that sense, all states have an obligation to avoid cuts so that we don't roll back on a state of rights enjoyment. So let's say in Egypt, for example, if we had X amount of our public budget given to education, and then the government decides to go take debt instead of finding a better way to raise resources that results in less allocation of money to education, results in girls literacy reducing, for example, from I don't know, like hopefully 95% to like 90%. It means that the government has violated its duty towards its citizens. So our community shouldn't suffer to pay creditors. And together as community organizations, our work is very important in gathering stories about how that harms people, in supporting local debt cancellation calls, and in pushing for fairer budgets that don't put people's rights and well-being last. So if we can move to the next slide. On issues of tax justice and redistribution. And again, that's probably all work that you're all involved with on a level or another, but maybe specifically in those multilaterals and what's happening today. Our governments have the obligations to make sure that the way tax is being collected is fair, meaning that rich corporations don't dodge taxes while average people overpay or pay more percentage of their income compared to those more rich and more powerful entities and individuals. So the governments have the duty to mobilize as much resources as possible and make sure there is no waste and there's no evasion of taxes in ways that we deserve to have allocated to us and our rights. And a number of community action around this is tracking how taxes are being used locally, joining campaigns for tax justice, and really accessing data on national level that while global organizations may not have the ability to access to make the case for fair tax policies. And languages, really sometimes even local languages are necessary to access this data and trace how taxes are being raised and allocated and spent. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so another issue that comes strongly in those multilateral conversations is around climate finance and what happens to how the money is raised around climate change. And the assessment now is that the money that is being allocated to how the climate is changing around us is very, very small. And instead, there is a pattern of debt-based financing for climate solutions. That means that instead of governments fulfilling their obligations of ODA that Fiana referred to, meaning instead of paying what they are actually owed to global South countries because of the historical injustice that of extracting resources and doing polluting activities in global South countries, they instead give a loan, and a loan gives us with a debt, and then the debt means we have to pay it back. So in a way, it's like pouring money into a bucket that has a hole in it. So as a global community, we are advocating for no debt solutions for climate. There is a trend to do debt for climate swap as well, saying, okay, well, if you do those climate activities, we're going to erase some of your debt. And this is also what we think of as a false solution, because instead, global South countries to be acting in a just manner is to allocate new resources rather than erase debt, that to say that this is how, you know, this is how you have more resources, because at the end it's the same pool of money.
Mahinour, I'm just coming to let you know that Meja has to leave at 11, so I want to make sure he has time. So if you can just wrap
Sure.
up, we can always come back to some of these topics in the discussion.
Okay, I'm happy to do that then, and yeah, we can always pick up later. Yeah, so just quickly, an example of how communities can help with this is to share the local impact of how those false solutions for climate aren't helping the communities as they claim to do, and that then gives us a connection between the local impact and the global calls for a different solution. So I will stop here. I'll give the floor to Meja, and then we can come back to more of these topics if there's interest and time later.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I know there's so much to talk about and not enough time. But I do want to just introduce Meja, who's just going to share a little bit about how civil society and local actors specifically contributed and influenced the financing for development process. And that's also an example of how we all and others may be able to participate and influence similar processes. So Meja, if you want to unmute and go ahead.
Thank you very much. And let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me for this very important session. I think indeed this is what is needed for community to share the experiences and also learn from each other. I think from where I sit, and has already been said by Fiana, we are broader part of civil society that has been engaged with the financing for development process and the conference itself. And in that regard, we have been very much interested in, as the initial speaker, the opening speaker said, the issue of securing financial justice, but also bringing the voices of civil society to bear on these discussions. But as you know, the FFD process is a governmental process, a member state-led process. And as such, civil society, even though we have observer status, there's really a limit as to how far you can go to influence an intergovernmental process. So for us, for civil society, I think what we had going for us was the process for, for us, the need for us to self-organize among ourselves and across all the themes of financing for development. So you had groups dealing with debt, aid, ODA, trade, systemic issues, climate finance, tax, and private sector or private finance. So we had groups of individuals who I would say are obsessed about specific elements and were really pursuing those particular objectives. And of course, we had a standing pillar on the feminist approach to financing for development, which I think was very important. And because of that, we actually managed to get a very special session just for the feminists to be able to, in the tent, to be able to speak. Now, like I said, this remains an intergovernmental process. So for us, in the preparatory process, those were pretty much open, and civil society were able to take spaces based on those thematic areas that were highlighted. But as you know, there are preparatory processes and there are also negotiations. So when it came to negotiations proper, there was limited access. We could have access to unattributed documents, but we could not have, or we could even be observers in the negotiation rooms, but we would not have direct input into the negotiation process. But as you know, civil society, we are very agile. So we kind of formed alliances, particularly with the governments of the South, because of course they are usually blockers and enablers. And for us, working with governments of the South was very important, particularly because they aligned themselves with the positions that we took, largely because also they were just about justice issues for peoples of the South. So the financing for development, as it were, of course, there is the push, like somebody said initially, that it's about securing the system or protecting the system to continue aggravating the injustice that is doing the financial architecture, continuing the kind of injustice, or reforming it to bring about justice. And that is what civil society voice was about. And indeed, we were happy that the governments from the southern governments rather were very interested in that agenda. I have to report that most of the things that we were pushing for, some managed to get themselves in the document, albeit in a very watered down process. But now our role is really to make sure that the few gains we've obtained are followed through. And particularly on issues to do with campaign, a lot of work is needed to be done, especially by government by rich countries. So that is not just countries of the South and their civil society making noise, but we need to have a scenario where civil society in the North, communities in the North are holding the governments to account to some of these commitments they make in the global conferences. But at the same time, we need to have communities and civil society in the South, indeed, campaigning for more democratic ownership, inclusive partnership of communities in development agenda, and of course, strengthen accountability. And by accountability, I mean domestic accountability, where we are able to account to communities down on the ground and not really donors who are providing the funds. So I stopped there. I was given 5 minutes. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meja. I'm sorry you can't stay for the discussion, but I really appreciate that frank perspective on it, and how it pushed. It took a lot of effort. There's watered down results, but ultimately now it's about how do we move forward from that, and that is where Emma is going to come in and tell us a little bit about just what's next, how moving forward can we influence that? And there's a lot of questions and comments in the chat around that specifically, and we'll come back to that more, but what is MCLD's role? How does organizations contribute and participate when they don't have funding to do that? What about, these horrible things that we're seeing and not enough progress happening? So, Emma, over to you to give us some sense of a path forward.
Thanks, Nelly. Can you see my screen? Great. Okay. So I'll do my best to focus really on, what FFD4 has really changed, and then, like we just talked about, the next steps. And I'll try to, answer some of the questions also in the chat as we go. So in terms of what FFD has changed, we have just a few minutes here today, so do have a look. There was a Civil Society Forum Declaration and also a Feminist Declaration about the outcomes of the FFD text that are really comprehensive, so I would recommend that you have a look. But before I get to the text of the outcome document of Seville, I'd want to just spend sort of 1 minute highlighting that something like the Financing for Development conferences is not just about the outcome documents. It's about the process itself, because as was talked about before, it is still the only international space that has the mandate to deal with all of these core systemic economic issues where all countries have an equal vote. So unlike at the IMF, G20, G7, OECD, FFD is the only space where the Global South has that voice. And so spending an entire year in the negotiations of this text is a forum where the Global North has to engage with the priorities, the analysis, the solutions that the Global South is offering, that matters in and of itself, because that happens nowhere else. So the fact that there was a space for an entire year where the Global South came together really strongly and put forward ideas on reparations, on and over again highlighting that they do not have a seat at the decision-making table of global economic decision-making. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the global financial system is not working for them. And so making these demands across all of the thematic areas, in debt, in tax, in trade, in aid, in the private sector, in all of those areas, if the Global South isn't part of making the rules, doesn't have an equal vote in setting the rules in the first place, we're never really going to get very far, right? And that's what FFD was designed to do, not to fix all of the problems magically or to even change the global financial system in and of itself. The idea of FFD is that it should open some doors and new initiatives and processes whereby that more democratic decision making can start to happen. That's really the point of it. And so we did see, especially developing countries, use language of civil society, like on reparations, like on governance reforms, like on climate finance, that made it, into the official text in the end. So that was really great. So then when we look at the text, I'm not going to pretend it was amazing. It really wasn't. If you look at the moment that we are in now, these multiple intersecting crises of development, of debt, of climate crises, inequalities, etc. I think, only 17, 18% of SDGs are on track now to be achieved, right? What was agreed in the document called the Compromiso de Sevilla is nowhere, just doesn't get anywhere near what it needed to be to meet the moment. And it was incredibly frustrating and aggravating, right? Because they could have done a lot more. And it was within their power to do a lot more, and they chose not to. But when I say they, I want to be very specific that it was especially the Global North, especially the EU, and especially the UK, who blocked the most transformative proposals that were being discussed and put forward by the Global South. And the US left the process at the very end, by the way, just to have that noted. However, despite that being the case, unlike in Addis in 2015 for the third Financing for Development conference, this text does actually start, a few new things. It starts we wanted it to open doors. Instead, I say it opened a few windows, very small windows, that might be able to shift that decision-making power in economic decision-making eventually, maybe, but it really depends on how these things are implemented. And where the most important battles were fought this time was on the debt chapter. And so I'm happy to share there were a number of new agreements on debt. The one I'm going to share just for now is that there was an agreement to initiate a new UN intergovernmental debt process to address the gaps in the global debt architecture. And I know that sounds super vague and long term, and it's not going to change anything overnight, but it is literally probably the best opportunity that there's been in 40 years to change some of that power of decision making on the global debt system towards a more democratic space in the UN, away from the IMF, the Paris Club, creditors, because all of that, the entire system right now is designed by creditors and not by debtor countries, right? So that was really important. That was a major battle. The Global North really did not want that to happen. They fought till the last minute to try to not have that be the agreement, but it is now in the text. And so that's one of the big things we're all going to be looking at moving forward. But there were other good agreements as well. There were new global commitments, for example, as Fiana mentioned, on promoting gender-responsive budgeting, advancing discussions on gender-responsive taxation, dealing with disproportionate unpaid care burdens on women. And those are all really important things that, it matters when governments make commitments like that. But ultimately, that's up to all of us to hold them to account to in every single country, down to the local context. I'm just going to go, there's more there, but very happy to like get into all of what was agreed in the specific chapters as we go along in the discussion. For now, I'll just turn the final slide on sort of, this discussion on what do we do with this now, what's next. I think before we can spend a lot of time, like Fiana, Mahinour, and I, we spend a lot of time in these multilateral spaces, so we can talk to you endlessly about how to access them, how to engage with them, and we can do that. But before we get there, I think when we try to connect folks working at the local level to the national level, regional and global level, it's the most important thing is that all of us really have a very strong understanding of what our governments actually control and what is outside of their control. What can we hold them accountable to at the national level or local level, and what is actually something that we need to deal with in like a global space, right? That's, I think, number one. And then number two is we should all know, and I say that I'm located in the UK and nobody here knows anything about what their own government is saying in these multilateral spaces. And technically, right, they're supposed to be representing us, the people, yeah? And so that matters. We need to know whether our government is saying things that we agree with or don't agree with, and whether we need to challenge them on that or not. Then, yeah, so now we are all in this mode of starting to advocate for the strongest possible implementation of the most important paragraphs that were agreed in this text, in the Compromiso de Sevilla. But it's not only what was in this text. We are already asking governments to just make a bunch of new commitments that weren't even in the text because the text fell so short of what was needed. And that needs to happen at the local level, national, regional, and global level. And I know that those types of spaces, like the IMF World Bank annual and spring meetings, can be really exclusionary and super intimidating, but there are ways all the time in which, civil society supports each other to make it more accessible and to support folks working sometimes at the very local level to engage. So yeah, very happy to discuss that in the rest of the discussion. Final point is just to say, when it comes to global financial architecture reform and really changing these global, deeply entrenched dynamics of how the global South continues to get a really raw deal in the global system, know who your enemies are. The bad guys here really are the EU, the UK, the US, some of their allies like Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland. And you can see that in the FFD negotiations. And that's why FFD has been so useful sometimes, because you can see very clearly they are voting no on the best proposals because they want to maintain their power in the institutions and systems that they have right now. And it's very blatant, like it's very in your face. So that means that people in the global North have to hold our own governments accountable for that. And folks in the global South need to hold their allies in the global North accountable to doing that. And then finally, don't give up hope. We are trying to change the global financial system. That never will happen overnight. It's something that has to happen across the world over many, many years, and does happen. I think the most inspiring thing we've recently seen is that the group of African governments in the UN initiated a new process for a UN tax convention, which is the most significant thing that's happened probably since the 1940s in shifting that decision-making power on something that really matters to all of us, international tax cooperation rules, away from an exclusive body like the OECD, where it's only rich countries who are a member, and has put it squarely into the UN, where all countries have an equal vote. And so that's just happened. That was just a few years ago, and that process is happening now. So, but that didn't happen overnight. It came after 3 decades of tax justice advocacy, and so keep up the fight, no matter what level you work on, because that's the only way anything's ever going to change. Thanks. Very happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Emma. I love that was both a optimistic and realistic place to end. So now we're going to open it up for conversation, discussion across the speakers with all of you. Also, there's been a lot of action in the chat. And I'm going to just try to make sure I hit a number of those points. And a lot of the questions have been around how MCLD can feed in or should feed in. You know, especially we are a network of organizations, a place where, as Kathy pointed out, organizations from different sectors come together. So what is MCLD's role? What sort of gaps can we fill? I think some of the things that all of you have spoken to provide the start of a roadmap to that, and resonate with the work that we've already been doing. Things like, you know, Mahinour, you in your slides were starting to talk about specific suggestions, including raising awareness, joining campaigns, collecting stories. And Emma, in your point about, you know, the governments in these spaces are supposed to be representing their constituents. There's a role in advocating to our own national governments. And so maybe there's a role for our national associations to be playing in doing that kind of campaign building, awareness raising. But I'm curious from you and from anybody else on the call, yeah, where do you see MCLD specifically feeding in? Are there other groups that are similar, playing that kind of a role? And maybe after we hear a bit from that, John, I think that you have some ideas of some upcoming spaces that might be useful for MCLD to be part of. But first, over, yeah, Fiana, Emma, Mahinour, if you have any thoughts on that. And again, anybody else. Mahinour, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nelly, and everyone. And yes, I mean, there are a number of networks that also do similar type of work. Some are maybe specifically focused on climate, some are specifically focused on that, some are specifically focused on rights. So I think, to me, connecting all those networks together with everyone who's here would be brilliant. Happy to share some of these spaces that are already we're part of, and to me that's the beauty of coming together in such a space and introducing new actors in your space. So thank you again for that. And in addition to what I already said about on-ground work on raising awareness, monitoring impact, etc., a really important theme is that community work is essential, not just to make the case of the impact of the global policy that led us to not realizing sustainable development goals now, and why we need to change, because if we keep on repeating the same patterns, there's no way we're gonna end up with a different outcome, right? So not just to prove that assessment, but also as essential to offering powerful alternatives. So we found it really important to remind ourselves that community voices are not externalities to accommodate, but they rather offer indigenous and local solutions that are blueprints for sustainability. They're years upon years of wisdom and local knowledge of how the planet can be sustainable, of how people can live appropriately. So we don't need to be there in a way of like, oh, just don't harm us. No, I think it's more of listen to our community wisdom and follow that as the vision for a planet that works for everyone. So yes, just a plea to also share visions from local knowledge and wisdom.
Thank you. And actually, to that point, one of the questions that I'm reading between the lines and that I carried is, again, sort of like, okay, what are the real steps towards that? You know, John mentioned the major groups. Like, what does it, like, how do you actually join? What are the very practical steps of being part of that, or feeding in different ways? And one very practical way that was referenced at the very beginning of this call is that Local 2030, which is the UN's platform for localizing the Sustainable Development Goals, has reached out and asked, they're collecting exactly that, Mahinour. They're collecting stories of innovation and practice at the local level that could be scaled and should be highlighted. And so we will probably in October be trying to capture some of those stories and then share them through Local 2030. So that's one specific thing. But yeah, again, curious, like, what are the practical steps? What's the role of the major groups? I don't know if anybody has any insights on that. I don't, yeah.
I'm happy to have a stab at some of that. Just to go, I'm just going to go back to the first question and then I'll get to that. I think so there's a level at which so one level of this conversation is like, how can local groups working at local levels engage directly in the multilateral system? And there are ways. So for example, for the financing for development process at the UN, there is this, I don't think Meja actually named it. It's called the Civil Society Mechanism for Financing for Development, which is like the semi-official channel that civil society uses to organize, to engage in the FFD process. It now represents over like 900, probably more than 1,000 groups right now. And the way that they work is it's open to anybody to join. So loads of local folks are there, national level groups, but also big international NGOs. It's a really nice mix of folks. And you can literally like go on the website, fill in the form, and then you're a member. And then the way that they are organized are based on the different chapters of the financing for development text. So there's a debt group, a tax group, a aid group, et cetera, and that's how they organize. And through like consensus, they develop joint positions and proposals on how should now the follow-up of the FFD agreement be done. And then up until there's a next FFD conference, and then we'll be talking about that. So that's like one very specific way. But for example, with IMF, like my job used to be like my full-time job used to be supporting communities to engage critically with the IMF and the World Bank. So there are lots of different types of NGOs and organizations who can support anybody really to engage in different types of institutions. So that's like one way we can explore this, right? But I would say that like as a model, it's not going to be workable for like literally how many billion of people are there on the planet now to like be directly part of the decision making of these institutions, right? So at some point, also representation within civil society has to be really functional. So in a lot of these global spaces and regional spaces, we see regional networks who represent hundreds, sometimes thousands of other groups in their positioning, right? But very often when I speak then to local groups, they don't actually know what the organization that they are a member of is actually saying in these international institutions. So our own governance structures as civil society, we also need to like get in order, right? And make sure that you know and that you agree and that you are actively shaping, if not the stuff directly at the global level, through your, let's say, representatives, right? Through civil society networks. But then, sorry, finally, I would just also say that like there's also like the way to make any of this work, like the only way anything at like the multilateral level is going to be meaningful is for the work also to be happening at the local level separately. You know what I mean? So someone mentioned it in the chat. We can have fights all day long at the international level to get the global south a bigger vote and voice in international decision making. But if southern governments don't then actually use that power to represent their own people and benefit their own people, then what's the point of that, right? So that kind of work has to go together with national and local level work on democratic responsiveness, on transparency, on democratic accountability. And that is as valuable a piece of the puzzle, as the work that we're doing at the global level. And we don't all have to be doing everything at the same time. Like it's also fine for groups to just be doing one chunk of the puzzle. It's just really important that, as I said in like the slide, right, it's really good to understand where you fit into this big picture, into this big puzzle, so you understand where other people are doing other work and how you're really part of a much bigger movement, right? And how you can make sure you can be aligned rather than, inadvertently undermining each other's work, which is obviously not what we want to be doing. Thanks.
Yeah. Fiana, do you want to respond to that? Because there's a couple of other questions. We're not gonna have time to get to all of them, but I might throw out there.
Just quickly, two things. I agree absolutely with Emma that the work also has to be done in multilateral fashion, as in what decisions get made at global fora and how to get representation at the global forum is important, but also local and community-led development and its models being showcased at the most immediate level that you have access to is just as critical. And functionally, how we can showcase that local development, that community-led development model at, let's say, a forum like Financing for Development is through partnerships. So, for example, at FFD, Oxfam has local partners, both based in Spain, as well as across Mexico, et cetera, which partners demonstrated their local efforts, their local models of developing care systems. And having that care system, that framing, that model of delivering care in a very local context, like a municipality, like at city level, expressed in a global forum, challenges the global standards and global norms. You get what I'm saying? So finding opportunities to leverage the work that you're already doing for community-led development, also to challenge the norms, challenge the existing models, I think is an exceptional role that MCLD is perfectly set up for. And then lastly, I think it is really important to think about different governance structures outside of formal like parliaments, presidential roles, et cetera. So oftentimes in like community contexts, there are various governing structures that include like chiefdoms, that include more informal, like in the South Asian context, like panchayat, like discussion forums that are already very organic to local community contexts that don't translate very well at the UN because it is entirely based around member states, which is a colonial formation of governance, right? So figuring out ways to also translate at the most local level or community level decision-making through either representation, as Emma suggested, or through the models being showcased through your work is important to think about as well.
Awesome, thank you. We're not gonna probably have time to answer this, but maybe one of you has a nice wrap up to this question, like a one statement, but I'm gonna combine two questions, one from Roger and one from Dr. Rebecca, asking, Dr. Rebecca asked, like, what would it look like to achieve what we're looking to achieve? And Roger asked, with the state of the world, shouldn't we be focusing at national and local levels? Yeah, local, regional, continental, like why should we be focusing on the global level? So I don't know if one of you has a sort of a nice summation statement on like what could happen. What is the possibility of advocacy at the global level rather than focusing on these other levels. And I understand that we're all saying like you need it at all the places. And then Aisha, I know you had your hand raised also. If there's anything you want to say at the last moment, and then John, but does any of you have anything you want to say to that in response?
Yeah, good evening. My name is Aisha from Nigerian chapter, SAGD, that's Strategic Action for Community Development. I haven't had all was said. I just want to make one or two contributions that I think it will move our community movement for community-led development much more better at the local forum. Now, looking at the global forum at the things that like that, but coming down to the local level, I was thinking the best engaged community better. I think we emulate some things like I've seen in other movements that was really key, and I would like to share it here. Things like the local financing models. These are things that brings community together, and then they can also, be financially viable to some extent. That small of their needs, they can be able to satisfy such things. And then also, if we can introduce some tools that will also let the community to be able to take data for themselves, which they can always refer to it and use it themselves, because most time data it's key and it's a problem because we don't really have data down there at the local level. So these are things that when we introduce to the community, I think it will empower them much more better, build their capacity, and also make them understand the nitty-gritties of what policies are, what means for them to be able to speak out, what means for them to make decision at the right time, at the right place, but then they have to know what actually they need to do. So these are things that due to maybe lack of capacity or mentorship, these are challenges and problems that we see down at the local level. So I'm thinking if MCLD can look at such things and then cascade it down to other like members group like the SAGD, I think this will go a long way in.
Thank you, Aisha. Yeah, I'm hearing two things there. One is to be sharing more models around local financing, data, and I'm not sure if you're talking data about like
our aims, our goals, and what are you. Thank you very much, and over. This is my case here.
Thank you, Aisha. I think it cut off at the end, but on local financing models and also around data. I don't even know if you mean like phone data to participate in events, or if you mean like data of information of what's happening. But either way, I think finding spaces to share that across, and then also to collect those stories and share them upwards into these global forums as models, as you said, that can be scaled. Emma, I know you want to respond to the other question also, and then John. And we're over time already, so people need to go. You're welcome to go. We'll just give a couple of updates at the last minute right after we hear from them. Thank you, everyone. Emma?
Thanks. I'll try to be really brief, just to say, in terms of that question on shouldn't we be working more now at the national and local level rather than global? I think we can't really afford not to work on the global, because I mean, some of these crises we have, like climate change, tax abuse, there's no other way to solve them than international cooperation. I would say that the current context means it's particularly difficult to make progress in the institutions that are dominated by the global north, and especially the US, because they're completely withdrawing from the concept of multilateralism right now. But that makes it even more important to celebrate and uphold the multilateral processes that are democratic, like FFD, like the UN Tax Convention process, where the Global South is leading and getting on with business, solving problems without the US needing to be there. And it's incredibly powerful to see that happen in real life, where actually the US isn't deciding everything anymore in these spaces. And that's moving more and more, right? So as difficult as this current time is, it is also offering some new opportunities to shift power dynamics in a way that literally hasn't happened in sort of 80 years, you know. And then on the second question on like, you know, what could happen here? Like, what's the vision? Honestly, that's up to all of our imagination and our ability to envision a different alternative world and a different economy that works for everybody. You know, in 1944, it was just a bunch of dudes, mostly northern dudes, who came together and came up with the global financial system as it works today, right? It was just some guys coming together, making up rules, and that's still what we're largely living under now. You know, we made this system was man-made, and it really is up to every regular human being to change it. But what we're seeing, you know, a lot of the work, even from civil society, on these alternative visions for global financial architecture reform are still super male dominated, super global north dominated. It's a bunch of very academic, very smart men in think tanks, you know, who've written books about this stuff. And until it actually comes to the people who have their own visions, who can actually, you know, use their knowledge, for example, and their experiences with local financing models to inform how we should be making decisions about resources at the global level, we're not going to get to that vision of at least for us, we're looking to establish economies that are shaped and serve marginalized communities, you know, and it's up to our imagination to really fill in what that looks like in practice. So I invite you to vision and work on yourself, you know, what you think that alternative global financial system should really look like.
And indeed,
Thanks.
that's something that MCLD has been pushing for. In creating our new strategic plan, all of the national associations did strategic visioning processes. And I think then then the next step is communicating those at a global level. And Aisha, to your point, Fiana is pointing out that one of the things that Gunjan, when she was able to be present at Financing for Development, was pushing for was around local financing models and having there be less dependency. You know, self-reliance is one of our pillars, moving past ODA because ODA is not reliable. So not being dependent on those streams of funding. John.
Yeah, I just want to plug that you can work at all these levels by working with local governments. One of the strongest voices at the UN system is UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments. They are really well organized. They bring local people to these meetings. They have regional teams. They have local meetings. They have real voice. And when you look in the climate space, for instance, local governments have been way more progressive than national governments, and they can put pressure on the national governments. Like in Nigeria, for example, the Supreme Court there just ruled that 25% of the budget must go, no strings attached, to the local governments. That's huge. That's more than even in Kenya. It's almost Kerala level. So the fact that a parallel multilateral process among local governments and local actors is happening is a place where we can plug in addition to civil society networks.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, so much for all of the comments in the chat. I hope we hit on many of them, if not all of them. Again, we will share the slides. We've recorded this call. It'll be available to everyone. We'll share that in an email. And I think a great resource might be, I think, Emma, it was you who said that you've been working with communities and local organizations on how to actually feed in the past. In the past, I think you said. Well, maybe with you all, we can build like a document that just lists some really specific ways that not just MCLD as a whole, but also our individual members and our national associations can feed in so that we have that. With that, I'm just going to plug a few reminders. Our upcoming events, August 13th, in recognition of International Youth Day, which is actually the 12th of August, I believe. MCLD's Youth Task Force is going to lead the Leadership Development Call. So please join for that. On August 28th, as always, the last Wednesday of the month, is the Global Call. We mentioned the beginning, we have 2 opportunities to give input into some of these multilateral policies, to share some of the specific stories and innovations and things that are working in all of your practices and across our network. That will be with the OECD in September, and with Local 2030, as I mentioned, in October tentatively. And the OECD, by the way, is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the major group of, or one of the major groups of funder countries. And then 2 last plugs, next slide, Sarah, is we've shared the strategic plan, the 2025 to 2029 strategic plan draft. It was built on the inputs that all of you prepared through the strategic planning, the visioning process, and the Global Assembly has taken all of that and turned that into a draft. And now it's ready for your feedback. And then the other thing to plug is that a survey was sent out to make sure that we have the different focus areas that all of our members work on, so that when there are opportunities to share your story in a publication or in a newsletter, to have a speaking slot at one of these forums, if there's a event or a funding opportunity that's particularly relevant to you, that way we can share it directly with you all. So please fill that out. If you're interested, I can put the links in the chat. And we will leave it at that. Thank you again so much to Emma and Mahinour and Fiana and Meja for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody. In MCLD tradition, we can all come on video and off mute in the whole screen format, Sarah, if you don't mind, and everybody can say goodbye in their own language. So.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Pastor. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Sister Rebecca.
Bye.
Bye.
How are
Thank you.
you?
Thank you.